Eric Silas. I have been doing silat since 2007, and I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Mande Suwanda because of my previous teacher. And then after speaking with Bambang and with Hilda, she suggested that I speak with Steve. And since I've gained a new understanding of silat and a new understanding of the Suwanda system. So today we're going to do a quick interview. Well, maybe quick, but we're going to try and introduce our community to Steve. It seems like he's been kind of under the radar, and I feel like maybe that's a loss for us. So, are you ready, Steve?
I'm all set.
Awesome. So let's talk about to start with. Let's talk about who are you, and what were you doing in the martial arts world before you met Pa Herman?
Okay. Well, I was Herman's senior student in the United States. I started my martial arts career in 1960 in judo. So I spent about 13 years in judo. When I was in college, senior year, I was majoring or minoring in Chinese studies, and I started Tai Chi training in 1971. Um, did that for, well, I still do that off and on. Then in 1974, I met a Indonesian exchange student who introduced me to Pencak Silat. I knew he was a martial artist, and we met through a mutual friend who did martial arts, but I didn't know what he did. I had thought he was a kung fu stylist, but um, it turns out he had some Kuntao background and a family style through his uh, through marriage with his aunt. She had married a Chinese gentleman who had a family style of kung fu, but most of our emphasis was on Pencak Silat when we trained. That was again in 1974. We trained. He was working on his master's and then his PhD, and when we trained from 74 until about 79, and he went back to Indonesia at that point. In late 80, I moved to San Francisco kind of on a whim. I didn't really plan on moving there, but I was out there for a martial arts workshop and applied for a job just to see what they would say, and I got the job. So
Awesome.
I immediately went back to Michigan, where I was from, and packed everything I could in my car and drove out there. Um, at the time, I didn't expect to find any Pencak Silat in San Francisco area. Um, I was planning on studying Tai Chi and maybe some form of Kung Fu, but as it turned out, I had a girlfriend who worked in a restaurant there, and one of the cooks there was Indonesian. And so I said, well, just ask him if he knows of anybody teaching Pencak Silat in the Bay Area. And he came back and said he had just been to the consulate a couple days before and saw a advertisement on the bulletin board in the consulate for Pencak Silat lessons. So he got me the number to call, and I called Herman, uh, we went over to his house. We started training. So it would have been in spring of '81. Um,
Wow. So you said the spring of '81. So I think a lot of people don't realize just how early Paul Herman was in the United States and how early he was teaching.
yeah,
Because I haven't heard of many students that had started training that early.
yeah. He actually arrived, I believe, in the fall of '80. Um, he didn't, as far as I know, have any students at that point. He came there, um, and he and his wife intended for him to make money not from Pencak Silat. He intended to teach it, but more as a hobby. He intended to make money as a puppet maker. He thought he there was a market for that, and unfortunately, there was not much of a way to market that kind of a thing back then. No internet, no you basically had to advertise in magazines, and they got expensive. It was not cost effective. But for the first, I don't know, 2, 3 years, he spent a lot of time making puppets in his living room. He'd go over there and he'd be carving puppets and painting them and so on. So anyway, from like I say, spring of '81, I practiced with him in San Francisco in his home. He didn't have an outside location to practice. He lived in a older home on 19th Street in San Francisco, and friends of his wife's owned it. They lived in the upstairs apartment, and Herman and Suzanne lived in the downstairs apartment. So we practiced there for maybe a year. We practiced in his living room. Um, and after about a year, he started having more students coming in. So we moved down to his basement. But even at that point, we probably never had more than 3 to 4 students at any one time, and they just didn't stay. And by this point, Herman was actually teaching in 3 locations. He was teaching in Berkeley, he
Okay.
was he was teaching in San Francisco, and he was teaching in Santa Cruz. So he would didn't have a car at the time, so he would take the BART, the Bay Area's version of a subway,
Yeah.
yeah, up to Berkeley, and then he would take the bus down to Santa Cruz to teach there.
So it's
Um,
kind of interesting. Like from what I gather, a lot of CLOT takes place out of the home. It's more. It seems more uncommon for people to find CLOT in official schools. I mean, even my journey, I started learning out of my teacher's garage. So it's again, and he was one of Pa Herman's seminar students. Um, and so it's kind of neat to see that that pattern isn't just my experience, but it's the experience for a lot of people.
right. No, and that was the experience even with my first teacher, in at Michigan State University. His name was Ariadno, and he was a graduate student there. He didn't have a large place to practice, but we would just practice wherever we could, either in the student union. There were usually empty rooms we could practice, or in the garden area or whatever. But yeah, he had no real school either, and he only had about 4 students, so he kept his teachings or his classes small, and everybody pretty much stayed at that time. We had a couple of students who started out and they dropped out, but for the most part, the 3 or 4 of us that were left stayed for the entire time he was there. Um, but it was a different environment than San Francisco. San Francisco, there's so many martial arts schools and so much kung fu, particularly. It's just a hard environment to really get a foothold in.
It seems like I've spent a little time in San Francisco, and it's a really nice area. But yeah, there's a lot of martial arts to be had, and it'd be really difficult to figure out where you want to go if you don't have some sort of guide or some sort of background to start with.
And if you go down on Sunday mornings in Golden Gate Park in the Panhandle area, there are a lot of free or almost free kung fu classes down there. So there's just a lot going on, and it's hard for people to really decide what they want. Uh,
In that time period, were the teachers competitive with each other, or was it more of a hey, come try this out, come enjoy it, have fun, and if you stay, great. If you don't, that's okay too. Or were people trying to poach each other's students?
For the most part, what I saw, they were pretty friendly. They weren't was not a lot of competition for students. You either came and enjoyed what you did, or you came wasn't for you. I didn't see a lot of competition um, at that point.
Did you spend a lot of time with Pa Herman um, outside of training in CLOT?
Well, I would go. I worked not far from where he lived, so I would stop in maybe every other week for an evening for dinner or for just coffee or something, just to talk, and not really to train. And then we had our regular training day, which is turned out to be Saturday mornings. But yeah, I step in once a week or so, or once every other week to have coffee and talk and do things like that.
Were those Saturday training sessions, were they like really long, drawn out, or were they kind of like pretty short with maybe some juice, or did you work a lot of bua? Like, what was that like?
A lot of the emphasis on the Saturday morning training, well, a lot of the training was just me because he had very few students that would in San Francisco that would stay. As I mentioned, they'd come and go, but a lot of emphasis was placed on Chimande at the time. So we spent a lot of time doing Chimande training. Um, we did a little bit of everything, a mix of everything else also, but his main emphasis back then was on Chimande.
That's kind of neat because Paul Bongbong has been talking about Chimandi a little bit more recently. When you started with your Chimandi training, was it standing or was it more the seated bua, or where
No,
did?
it was seated. It was seated. You have to do the seated first. Without the seated, you don't have the base to. In the seated training, you're building up your arm strength and the strength of the forearms, and that all comes from the seated training. You know.
Very cool. That's exactly what Hilda has been saying when we've talked as well. There's a lot of emphasis on Chimande standing up right now. It's surprising to hear Paul Bumling's perspective, and then to hear you say exactly the same thing. So it's kind of cool.
Well, if you go to Chimande Village, if you visit there, you'll see that they're not practicing standing up for the most part. The base is all sitting. You don't see the standing Jews very often up there. Um, it's almost all sitting because you need that sitting in order to build up that base, to build up the strength in your arms, your forearms.
I've noticed that it also helps build flexibility as well. So some of the students have kind of had some issues with some of the positions and the transitions in
Oh,
the seated bois rather than standing, and that's kind of neat to see. And it seems pretty developmental, almost as if you're maybe even doing them a little bit of a disservice if you don't work some of the seated material as well, or starting as Papang has suggested.
right. Yeah, it's a good core training. I mean, you're
Yes.
moving your legs, you're pulling your legs in and out, and yeah, it's excellent conditioning training as well as forearm training.
So, how I know you went to Indonesia, so how long was it before you actually made that trip? What was that like?
I went there originally in December of 1984. There there were about six of us going at the same time. It wasn't a seminar type of situation, and we didn't travel together, but we just kind of converged at Herman's area. I mean, he knew we were coming, and his father had rented a home for us to stay in, and we would train in that home, and then um, spend in the morning, then spend the afternoons just being tourists. We'd look around. We went to the beach sometimes. We'd go shopping. Went we spent one entire day in the village in Chimande, um, which was interesting because we Herman's mother grew up in the village right next to Chimandi. She was well known. She was a Chimandi practitioner when she was a teenager, and of course Herman was no one there. But they brought us there, and I think the four of us went, and they they Herman's mother explained what they wanted. They wanted them to show us some of the training, and so they said fine, and they put us into a nice house. They set us in this nice house and said we'll be back in shortly. Well, they were gone for like 3 or 4 hours, and in the meantime, they came in and they gave us water and they gave us fruit. They're very nice, but we found out later that um, this, they weren't sure if we were Dutch or not, and they were not willing to teach the Dutch. At that point, all the leaders of the Chimandi and most of the Penchaxalat systems were old freedom fighters, and they did not care for the Dutch. So they finally decided, okay, we don't believe they're Dutch. We understand they are from America. And so they did that at that point, then show us some of the training and so on. But
So even with Iwamimi's endorsement, they still had to decide for themselves if you were Dutch or not.
they did. They did. And we didn't know why we were sitting there. Even she didn't know why we were sitting there for so long. It was only afterwards that she talked to them and said, they explained to her why they left us sitting in that house for so long. But
Did you spend time with other members of the family? Like, is that when you met Pa Bongbong? Is that when you met Ika? Like, how did all of that come about? Like, when did you meet other members of the family besides Pa Herman and Susan?
well, the first member of the family I had met actually before the trip to Indonesia. I met Herman's mother came over to San Francisco and stayed with Herman and Suzanne for 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe probably around 82. I would say either 82 or possibly 83. I don't recall exactly. So I knew her already. I had known her from her stay in San Francisco. So and then when I went there, all the members of the families came and introduced themselves to everybody. Um, Rita did a small demonstration. Ika did a small demonstration for us. And then it was mostly talk. We just kind of sat around and talked about things and just got to know each other. Didn't see a lot of the family after that. I mean, they were all busy with their own
Life.
lives. I mean,
Yeah.
Rita was starting a family. Dadang was worked full time as a landscaper for the Parks Department, so he was busy. Um, the person we saw most was Ika, and Ika's at the time boyfriend, now husband, Tolib.
Okay.
Ika it was her job to provide us breakfast and lunch. And she didn't cook, so she'd go across the street to the market, and usually our breakfast consisted usually of fruit, which was good. It was nice. It was fresh fruit. It was good fruit. Occasionally, I think once or twice, she'd go and have them make eggs and rice for us, but it was mostly fruit. Lunch was pretty light. It was maybe some rice and some fruit or maybe a little bit of fish or something in there. But lunch was fairly light. And then for dinner, either the mom cooked or we would go out to dinner someplace.
So what times are things like breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Are they similar to what we would see in the United States, or are the timings a little different?
Yeah, it's pretty close to the same. I would say we'd get up, we'd have breakfast maybe around 7:30, somewhere in that area, and then we would practice with Herman um, in the living room of the house, maybe from 9 till 11 or so. Then we'd take a break and do whatever we're going to do. Everybody kind of had their own time to do whatever they felt like doing. And then we'd have lunch around noon or so. Then the afternoon, like was for the most part touristy stuff. Now I was there specifically to test for my white belt. So
Oh,
in
okay.
in, in the afternoon, when everybody else was out doing the touristy stuff, I would come back about 4 o'clock, and Tolib, who was Ika's um, husband now, boyfriend at the time, was assigned to get me ready for the test. So I would work every afternoon for a couple hours with Tolib after you finish school. Um,
So, in that's kind of interesting. So I don't think that there are any other people that have kind of moved down that progression, at least that are fairly well known within the system. I don't know of anyone else who has their white sash or their white belt in Mande Muda or Mande Suwanda besides you? Like you're the only one.
There was none at the time. And there's still, as far as I know, has never been anybody else who's actually gone that route. Now, with the Jugabaya training, the system has changed somewhat. Herman kind of got away from the belts for a while. Bambang is kind of wanting to reintroduce them. But yeah, I was the only one who actually went that route. There might have been one person. I don't remember if he got his red belt or not. I know he was getting ready for it. I can't remember if he actually got it or not. But yeah, there was also a yellow belt level at the time, which was pretty much required to be a member of the Suwanda family. And there were 3 yellow belts there. The Herman was a yellow belt. His dad, of course, was a yellow belt, and Dadang was a yellow belt. And they all 3 of them tested me for the when I went for the white belt test. In fact, Dadang was my partner for the test. He was my when there's sparring or when there's any kind of 2-person form. Dadang was my partner for the test.
So 84, how old was Pa Bongbong when you met him? I mean, he was not Pa Bongbong at the time. So how old was he and what was that like?
Well, see, he was 5 years younger than me. So in 84, I would have been 34. So he would have been 29.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Did you train with him at all during that period, or was it more
so? Babang, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Herman was 29. Babang would have been, I think, about 10 years younger. So, no,
okay.
Yeah, not really. We didn't train much together. He was teaching at the schools, at the grade schools or at the public schools for his dad. So a lot of his time was spent at that, and then his free time, he wanted to be a musician, and so he was doing a lot of practicing with different groups and solo, practicing on his own. So didn't get a chance to practice very much with him.
So I've seen a little bit of his some photos of him in leather jackets and some of the rocker type stuff that it looks like he was involved in at one point, which is kind of cool. I just never expected to see that from Indonesia. Since I found some really good metal from Indonesia, so it's clearly not as surprised, or I shouldn't be as surprised as I am. I like metal from Brazil as well. So
okay.
Yep. So since you stayed there for a while, and how long did it take you to prepare and to get your white belt?
Well, I've been preparing before I came there with Herman, and I think I was there. I think we spent about a month preparing in San Francisco, I think practicing totally primarily for that, and then I got my white belt. I'd have to look at the certificate, but sometime in the middle of January. And then after that, I went to Bogor, which is where my original teacher lived, and I spent some time with him. And then I went back to San Francisco end of January, early February, someplace in that time frame. Herman went back around that same time, maybe a week or 2 later. Most of the people either kind of dispersed and did some exploring on their own or went back to San Francisco. He had one student from Berkeley who was actually named was Patty Ruppelt, actually stayed there for 7 or 8 months. She was there for quite a while.
Wow. Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah.
So you never mentioned it, but Hilda mentioned at some point that you had a school in Indonesia or some sort of business there. Do you mind talking about that?
We didn't have a school. I never had a school there. My name is on Herman's school because of my support for him and for the school. But no, we had a a business there, but it was a video business. It was primarily aimed at the TV stations, the newly emerging TV stations back then. Prior to about 1989 or 90, TV stations in Indonesia were all government run. Um, they're they very much controlled what was shown. They only broadcast about 6 or 8 hours a day.
Mm.
And then, like I say, around 89 or 90, they opened it up and they said, okay, we're going to allow, private broadcasting. And so
Okay.
TV stations either sprung up in different cities or they became more independent. But there was very little technology for them to do things like 3D logos and uh, any kind of sophisticated computer work. And so Herman was an artist, and we had started shortly after he moved to LA around 1987, learning how to do video editing because he wanted to do VHS tapes at the time. And so that was how he got started, just doing that. And I had a little bit of computer background, and he had the art background, so we kind of taught each other.
Very
Um,
cool.
I was never the artist that he was. I did simple stuff, but he was really the artist. But um, yeah, we went there in I believe it was 91. We went there, um, started a business there. Um, there were two companies in Indonesia at the time that did what we did. We were in Bandung, and there was a company in Jakarta that did what we did. If you prior to and we both started around the same time. Prior to that, if you wanted that work done, you had to go to Singapore for that work.
Wow. Okay.
So we actually were very successful fairly quickly. We were actually making a profit within the first year, and we were doing well. We were well known. Um, but then the president's son, he had two sons. The president's sons had a lot of money and didn't know what to do with it, and they decided that they were going to take over this industry. And so they went to all the TV stations and said, "We're doing this now. You will only buy from us. You will not buy from anybody else."
Gotcha.
So that put both our company and the company in Jakarta out of business. Uh, and the like everything else the Suns did, pretty much it didn't last. They did it for a year or so and just enough to drive us out, and then they just didn't do it. They were involved in a lot of enterprises. They owned Lamborghini for a while. They bought Lamborghini, and
Like outright or
yes, outright. They owned Lamborghini in the 90s for a couple months, for a couple of years, and they didn't know what to do with it. As far as I know, they didn't produce any new models. They didn't do anything. But yeah, they had lots and lots and lots of money, and no really idea what to do with that money.
so again, this is like one of those things where you mentioned, I'm like, I would have never guessed that any Indonesians owned Lamborghini, or even like I just would have never thought that. That's
It wasn't for very long, maybe 18 months or 2 years or something of that nature, because they didn't know what to do with the company, but they did for a short time own it.
So after you, besides the business that you guys were doing, you said that was in Bandung where you had that business.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So after that, or besides that, when in the United States, did you continue working in Pinchuk Silat? Was it called Mande Muda then? Was it
It was
Sawada Silat or?
it was Moneywood at that time, yeah.
Okay. So were you guys still doing a lot of that, or did you ever teach any, or?
I taught in San Francisco for a time in Golden Gate Park on one evening a week, but I worked in IT and I was on call a lot, and it just became a problem because there were no cell phones at the time. I had to carry a pager, and so if a pager went off in the middle of class, I had to try and run around and find a phone to call and see what was going
Right.
on. It's a difficult thing, but um, Herman at the time was living in LA. Then when we moved in 91, when we started the business, he moved to Bandung. He actually left LA. He and his wife sold the house there, and um, moved to Bandung. He did some seminars, I believe, during that time, but he really didn't have a whole lot. Didn't spend a whole lot of time teaching, other than his family. He didn't spend a lot of time teaching other students. He was pretty much spending most of his energy on the video business.
So how did he make it back to the United States after moving back to Indonesia?
Well, he and his wife at the time, Deborah, were having some issues, and um, the business had, as I said, kind of gone down. We couldn't do that kind of work anymore.
Right.
Herman was working, actually had some other contacts in the TV business, and he had done some commercials. He had filmed some commercials for them, and he was working on possibility of doing a little martial arts TV show. And but none of that was really money making type of a thing. It was just kind of something to do for fun, and he did make some money, but not a lot.
So is there like a Paul Herman pilot floating around somewhere that we might be able to find? Is there some unknown, unseen?
It's very difficult. I don't know where to come up with it. There was one made, and Tolly was the star of the thing.
Okay.
And but yeah, I there was one made. Whether it exists anymore or not, I have no idea. I've not seen it in years and years. I actually may have a copy on videotape. I have to look. I've got all my stuff's in storage, but um,
If you ever find it, that's something I'd be super interested in seeing.
yeah, if I
Sounds
find it,
awesome.
I'll get it converted to DVD, and then it'll be available to folks if they're interested in seeing it. It was just a short little pilot. It was I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I don't recall right now, but it was just a short little clip.
That's longer than a sizzle. So that's actually pretty long. Like
Yeah,
I know with movies now, if you got a 5 minute trailer, people would be like, "Oh my god, this is
right,
great."
right.
Um, so again, when I first heard your name, Hilda and Steve said that you were an advisor for them. So how did you become an advisor for Mande Suwanda? Like, what was that process, and what does that actually mean that you are the advisor?
It just kind of happened. I never planned on it. And I don't actually know what it means. I don't know what my position is. I mean, I don't teach particularly. I may help Hilda teach occasionally, but I'm not really a teacher. I think I help them with ideas and possibilities of ways to do things that might be uh, helpful in promoting their system. But yeah, there's no defined role. I really don't know what my defined role is. It's just whatever they find helpful.
Well, I know that one of my students has mentioned some things before, and we've talked about the idea of the person who knows everything. And for me, you seem to be that person when I talk about silat. And not the neat thing about it is that you consistently said I don't know when you don't know something, um, and that's appreciated because we're so disconnected from Indonesia. So there's a lot of information that we're just not going to know. And so
Right.
the internet is not the best source.
Right.
It's just
It's
not.
not. And I don't see any purpose in saying I know something that I don't, because that's just misleading people. And eventually people will find out, so eventually
Yes.
somebody's going to find out. So there's no purpose in misleading people, to my mind.
Um, well, that I mean, it's kind of neat. We've kind of covered most of the questions that I had that I wanted to go over. What what would you like to say? Like, what do you think people might want to know or need to know, or what would you like to talk about? What would you like to discuss? Like, how do you feel about where Monte Wanda is right now? Just the table's open. What do you want to say?
Well, I guess mm, the main emphasis for me right now is on helping promote Mande Suwanda and um, helping develop and promote the Jagabaya system. We have a group of Jagabaya students who we have a forum for. Um, I'd like to see that more active. I'd like to see folks throwing out more ideas of what they'd like to see and what they'd like to learn, or where they think they would like the system to go. Um, there's nothing written in stone at this point. So we're listening to suggestions. We can't obviously take everybody's ideas and every
Right.
suggestion that comes along, but yeah, I think become involved. Let us know what you're interested in. There are going to be people who are not interested in the Jugabaya program, because the Jugabaya program is specifically designed for people who want to teach Mande Suwanda. There are going to be people that don't want to teach. They have no interest in teaching, but they are interested in learning for their own betterment, for their own knowledge. And so we can tailor a program for them also, if we know what they are interested in, or if we know what they would really like to see. We have one Jagabaya student who's really, his primary interest is wrestling. And so that's what he likes. So he's doing Jagabaya 1 just to get a base, but he has no intention at this point, as far as I know, of going forward into the other levels of the Jagabaya. He doesn't want to teach. He wants to learn for his own knowledge, and as I say, his background in wrestling, and he's that's his primary interest.
Do
Um,
you know if he's going to be delving into Binjan and if he's going to
he
possibly?
had he
Awesome.
had already done yeah he had already done some minjang, or gotten some videos of the techniques, and um, he he's a very good analyst, and he compares and contrasts styles, and he'll look at what he was showing, and then he'll compare it to Western styles and say, this is very similar. This is a little
Yeah.
bit different, but it's a very similar concept. Or um, so yeah, that's where he's going, and that's fine. That's what he likes, and that's fine. We can accommodate that type of a person.
That was one of the reasons I was really glad I had the opportunity to learn material from Pa Bambang, um, because he was welcoming to that. I've trained in a lot of martial arts. In fact, my background was Japanese martial arts, and that's where I thought I would be for the rest of my life.
Yeah, me too.
Um, I didn't. That is not what happened. But it's great when you can see concepts from silat or binjan that you remember, or that I remember from some of the Japanese material that I worked.
Right,
And it's, the human body only moves a certain number of ways. So
exactly. And Herman used to emphasize that, there's only so many ways you can move that are efficient. So there's going to be overlaps. There's going to be similarities, because it's just the way the body moves. If you do something that's completely contrary to body mechanics, well, then what do you got? You got some kind of weird movements that might look good, but who knows what they do.
right. Will it work for anything other than an interesting exercise?
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, So, if people want to reach out to you, they want to get involved in Mande Triswanda, and they don't have a current teacher. What are you suggesting? What do you think people should do? How would you like them to make contact?
Well, they can contact me, but Hilda's really the primary contact at this time. She always throws up my name also as a contact, but they usually prefer contacting her, and I can understand that, 'cause I'm not Indonesian, she's Indonesian, so it's you kind of want to go to the source as best you can. So um, I,
It's it's really interesting. People want to do that, but they forget she's 12 hours away. So
right, exactly, and that's a problem. Sometimes she'll get
yeah,
messages in the middle of the night and stuff, and she tries to answer them as soon as she gets them, which is sometimes difficult at 3 in the morning
yeah.
or whatever. But, um,
spreading the load to the people involved seems like a better way of handling things. But I have also noticed that there are a lot of people that really prefer to be working with someone who is in Indonesia. And it's like, you do realize they're asleep.
Right. Right. Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Yeah.
um, well, I've enjoyed talking to you as usual. Is there anything else you would like to say before we close?
No, not really. I think this has been a good time, and I've enjoyed talking to you. And people are welcome to ask me whatever they want. As we mentioned, if I know the answer, I'll tell them. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell them I don't know. But I'm always willing to share what I do know.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, and I will be talking to you soon.
Sounds great. Talk to you later.
Have a great night.
You too.